some of the world's richest men, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison, they all get paid $1 salaries.
That means they'll only be taxed on that dollar in terms of their earnings.
Yeah.
That's so cynical. Oh my gosh.
Billionaires, it's not that they worked harder or smarter the game we're all playing at. They're playing a totally different game. Earned wealth cannot create billionaires. It's impossible. So the average UK worker would need to work something like 26,000 years to earn £1 billion.
Wow.
If you want to be as rich as Elon Musk and you earn around the average wage, you need to work 30 times longer than humans have existed, right? So 9 million years. So billionaires, they're not economic outcomes, they're economic errors. That's what makes wealth taxes so powerful. It's not about plugging budget holes. It's about protecting the earner way of life. It's about reprogramming the economy so it works for both wealth earners and wealth collectors.
Wow. Okay, yeah. It's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? Tax the rich. It's a slogan that comes up all the time. And it makes sense. Studies suggest that a global levy on the top 0.5% could raise about $2.1 trillion. That's roughly 7% of national budgets, with the UK alone bringing in sums around 31 billion a year. And that kind of money could be transformative if we used it to fund healthcare or education, affordable housing, long-term care, or even climate resilience. So why isn't it happening? It's a question that I keep coming back to. And from the responses we received to our call out on YouTube and on the Guardian website, a lot of you are asking that question too. So I'm speaking to Mark Bou Monsour from the Tax Justice Network, an advocacy group that works to raise awareness about all sorts of tax abuse. I want to ask Mark what a wealth tax could look like, how it could work, and what's holding governments back from introducing one. So I wonder, how is it helpful to understand extreme wealth and how it relates to the economy?
Yeah, so one helpful way I like to think about the economy is it's a computer program that we're constantly updating. And our regulations and our laws, they're kind of like the code that determine how the economy runs. So what can the economy be used for, who can use it, and so on. But the problem is, for decades now, when it comes to writing that code, our governments mostly just listen to lobbyists for the super rich and corporate lobbyists. And that has turned the economy into a tool that prioritizes the desires of the super rich over everybody else's needs. So when you think about it, our economies are supposed to let people earn the wealth they need for themselves, for their families, to live comfortable and secure lives. But the way our tax laws are coded, it allows the super rich to collect wealth a lot more easily than it is for the rest of us to earn wealth. And this has gotten so bad to the point where the super rich now have extreme wealth to the level of making our economies insecure and making it barely pay to earn a living today.
This distinction between collected wealth and earned wealth, so salaries, versus how a billionaire is actually accumulating their wealth. Could you explain that a bit?
Earned wealth is, when you get paid for what you do, for your work, so salaries and wages. Collected wealth is when you get paid not for what you do, but what you own. So dividends for owning stocks, rent money for owning real estate. Most people primarily earn their wealth, but when it comes to the super rich, their wealth is almost entirely collected. So if you look at some of the world's richest men, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison, they all get paid $1 salaries. They're famously known as $1 CEOs. And so the difference between collected wealth and earned wealth is really key in the eyes of our tax authorities, because not only does collected wealth grow a lot faster than earned wealth, collected wealth gets taxed a lot less than earned wealth. And because billionaires, their wealth is almost entirely collected, they end up paying tax rates that tend to be half what everybody else pays. So when we're talking about taxing wealth, we're talking about taxing collected wealth, that wealth that has gone untaxed for so long. And I think this is a really important distinction, because wealth tax, it makes some people worry. They see it as something that goes against meritocracy. Why should we tax more those who do better? But this is a misconception. Billionaires, it's not that they worked harder or smarter the game we're all playing at. They're playing a totally different game. Earned wealth cannot create billionaires. It's impossible. So the average UK worker would need to work something like 26,000 years to earn £1 billion. if you want to be as rich as Elon Musk and you earn around to the average wage, you need to work 30 times longer than humans have existed, right? So 9 million years. So billionaires, they're not economic outcomes, they're economic errors. And there's more and more of them cropping up in our economy in this computer program every year. And that's destabilizing the earner way of life the rest of us rely on. That's what makes wealth taxes so powerful. It's not about plugging budget holes. It's about protecting the earner way of life. It's about reprogramming the economy so it works for both wealth earners and wealth collectors.
And is that literally why they're earning $1 for their wage? Is because that means they'll only be taxed on that dollar in terms of their earnings?
Yeah.
That's so cynical. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
What's helpful about thinking about the economy as a computer program is it makes it clear that, the way our economy runs is a result of decisions that our governments have made and a result of who our government has listened to. So in that same way, we can recode the economy to prioritize everybody's needs, to work for everybody, not just the super rich. So I think that's what you're seeing a lot of now. You're seeing public perception catch up with what we've known for a while about the harms of extreme wealth. And so we're at this moment where people are demanding a big update to the code, right? They're demanding for government to do something about extreme wealth.
So I wonder if you could just describe what a feasible wealth tax looks like and how it would work.
So the best way to do a wealth tax is to do it as simple as possible. So that usually entails 2 steps. One is you set a really high bar and you only tax wealth above it. So you could say, the bar is 10 million pounds and we're only going to tax anything above that 10 million. So if you've got 11 million pounds, your first 10 million pounds aren't going to get taxed. And what that does is it makes sure only the super rich get taxed, and nobody below that bar won't get taxed. The second step is to apply that wealth tax to all assets. So what that does is it prevents the super rich from being able to shuffle their wealth around from one asset into another to underpay tax. So, if you only choose to apply the tax, say, to luxury vehicles like a yacht, the super rich can sell their yachts and buy Picasso paintings or gold or so on. So if you apply it to all assets, that prevents that problem. That's all a wealth tax really needs to be. It's quite simple. There are steps you could take to make it more effective. So you need to improve transparency measures, so that way we're correctly measuring individuals' wealth. But you could also do things like establish withholding taxes, which are kind of like exit fees. So we know the super rich, when you tax them, they do not migrate. This is a popular misconception. There's several studies show that they do not move, and it's a trivial factor in deciding where they live. But some governments still want reassurances against that. So a withholding tax is basically an exit fee that says if you want to leave, you still have to pay us a certain amount of your wealth. So it's kind of straightforward. Often what you will hear from lobbyists, though, is it needs to be more complicated and more complex. It needs to have more exemptions. You need to tax maybe not a full net wealth tax, but tax different sources. This is a deliberate strategy that we've seen used by lobbyists quite often, specific corporate lobbyists and lobbyists for the super rich, to create wiggle room in regulation. You create this gray area that then makes it possible to underpay tax.
Do we have estimates at what kind of revenue this tax change might generate?
So our friends at Tax Justice UK, they've calculated that a 2% tax on wealth above 10 million pounds could raise over 24 billion pounds every year, which is a huge sum of money.
That's kind of astronomical numbers for the public purse, isn't it? But it does kind of beg the question, why isn't this happening? I mean, I have heard arguments around, the super rich are very good at putting their assets in different places, hiding them. There's offshore accounts, there's tax havens. Is the government able to track down this wealth sufficiently to be able to tax it in the first place?
If the government can keep track of every tip in every tip jar in every cafe and restaurant across the country, they could find out who is getting millions in dividends from the biggest multinational corporations. We do need more transparency measures to make wealth taxes effective, but they are doable. There are over 100 countries now working together under a global standard that makes it a lot harder to hide money in foreign banks, right? And when we at the Tax Justice Network were campaigning for the standard many years ago, we were told it's impossible to do, and there's no way you get enough governments on board with it. And yet, it's a global standard today, and it's making positive difference.
And also, they must already know about some of it. I mean, even if they just started taxing what they do know about, that's going to be some revenue, and they can figure out the rest later.
It makes a lot more sense to introduce the wealth tax now, and the transparency measures will follow, because that's when you really need them, right? We actually seen the same thing happen in the past on income tax. When income tax was introduced many years ago, the argument against it was, how are you going to find out how much every single person is earning? It's impossible to do. It's many of the same arguments we're hearing today against wealth tax, but it was introduced, and we have income tax today, and it's very doable.
We had a question actually about other ways to tax wealth rather than this, like a wealth tax as we've described it. So stuff like land value tax. And we've heard about Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has talked about reforming inheritance tax, different types of property tax. Where do these fit into on the kind of spectrum of taxing extreme wealth? Are they effective?
These are all incomplete wealth taxes. Instead of applying a tax on net wealth, they apply tax on specific assets. Now, the problem with this is if you tax only one asset, the super rich can reshuffle their wealth around into another asset type and then underpay tax. The arguments behind this sometimes is, look, this is the way we've done it, and so let's stick to the way we've done it. But the reason things are the way they are now is because we've been giving special tax treatment to collected wealth. So if you stick to how we've done it before because it's easy, you're just keeping that special treatment in place. And what wealth taxes are about is ending that special treatment. It's not about plugging budget holes. It's about ending the special treatment. Collected wealth gets over earned wealth.
So you don't feel confident that some of these reforms will raise the tax that the government expects because it's so easy to move those assets around?
Yeah, you're setting yourself up in a non-ideal way. It is much more effective to tackle a wealth tax directly, get the transparency measures you need, and move on. But it goes beyond just sort of, revenue raising. It goes to the very question of, what is your economy about? What is your tax policy about? How do you justify continuing to give, massive tax exemptions and benefits to folks who, enjoy an extreme level of wealth, and the benefits you're giving them are then resulting in that wealth continuing to grow and then continuing to destabilize the economy for everybody else?
You mentioned some other arguments against wealth tax, such as the one that we hear most often is that if you introduce a tax like this, aren't all the billionaires just going to leave and take all their money with them?
So across, several organizations, several voices, this scare story has been widely debunked, including through government data. So there is no millionaire exodus that we've been hearing about. What this scare story does is it blocks the change folks want, right? And what's worse is when governments latch on to this story, they kind of use it to talk down to the public. They say, hey, we know you want this obviously good tax policy, but we can't do it because actually secretly it has this effect that, you as a non-economist don't understand. But it's straightforward and it's simple, and people should be able to see through this scare story for what it is.
I mean, even if the numbers that are quoted aren't robust or reliable, if we were to take it on face value and assume that there was a risk that there was this flight of millionaires and billionaires, would it have a substantial impact on the economy?
Not really, because it goes to this misconception about the role of extreme wealth and the super rich in our economy, right? It's about who creates wealth, who creates value. And, the example I like to give is if you were to send a billionaire to an island and, just isolate them there with all their wealth, with no contact to the rest of the world, they're not going to be able to create a single job. But if you send just a group of ordinary folks with nothing but the clothes on their backs to that island, they're going to build an economy. So it is this misconception about wealth.
I guess tax isn't the only reason that millionaires and billionaires move to the UK or have their residence here, is it? I mean, that's not necessarily why they've were attracted to live here or to spend their lives here, raise their families here. So I guess that's not the one factor that they're going to necessarily respond to.
Up there is London's cultural scene, but also what we find with wealthy individuals, but also with businesses, what they're looking for is they're looking for political stability, economic stability. They're looking for access to markets. You're not going to pick up everything and leave, take your kids out of school, relocate your businesses just to, pay a little bit less in tax. You're not going to leave your family and friends behind, move to a country where you don't speak the language just to pay a little bit tax. There's plenty of academic evidence that shows when you tax the super rich more, that results in little to no migration rates, right? And on top of that, there's studies showing that even among the super rich, they're not interested in moving to tax havens. One LSE study quoted the super rich as saying that tax havens are boring. And it found that among the super rich, there's a taboo about moving to another country just to avoid tax. Patriotic Millionaires UK found that 81% of UK millionaires think it's patriotic to pay your fair share. So this idea about, millionaires, leaving the second you sort of tax them, it has no evidence to support it, right? What it does have is a few vocal folks who make a lot of noise in the press about it. It has lobbyists who are keen to push that story forward, but it doesn't have actual data behind it. One thing I like to point out is when you ask, folks, hey, what would you do if you won the lottery? Nobody ever says, I'm going to leave my life behind and move to, a little tax haven where I don't speak the language, I don't know anybody, and where I don't have possibly the same freedoms I have here.
That's a really good point. I've never really thought about that. You would do that, would you? With all that in mind, it does beg the question why governments aren't implementing this. But of course, there are governments that have implemented a wealth tax. I wonder if you could give me, what are some countries that have tried this out and what has been the impact of that?
So countries like Norway, Spain, and Switzerland, but also Argentina and Uruguay and Bangladesh, they've implemented wealth taxes that have successfully brought in substantial tax revenue. But again, there's lots of room for improvement on these. So we estimate that if countries were to implement sort of a simplified version of the wealth tax that Spain has implemented, countries around the world could raise something like 2.1 trillion tax dollars a year. So to put that into perspective, that would match one of every $3 spent globally on public health. So it's a huge sum of money, and it could cover most countries' climate finance needs and still leave billions to spend domestically on other services. So it's a lot of money. Now, critically, this is a feather-light tax, right? So it's about 2% tax on just the upper crust of the richest 0.5% household's wealth, right? So it applies to a very few people, and it's so small they probably won't even notice it. And yet it could raise huge sums of money, roughly a third of what we're globally spending on public health.
Wow. And that's Spain's model. Could you explain a bit about what the Spanish model is and how it works?
The Spanish tax kind of works on two levels. You've got the sort of frontline regional tax that applies a wealth tax at a regional level. And you've got a second wealth tax, which is sort of the backup tax that applies at a national level. So the reason the national wealth tax was introduced was that at one point Madrid stopped applying its regional wealth tax. It wanted to sort of make itself into a local tax haven. So that way folks from other parts of the country move to Madrid, which is a lot easier to do within a country than, say, to move to another country. And so, the Spanish government wasn't having any of that. So they introduced this backup tax that says if you don't apply your regional wealth tax locally, we will apply it and collect that wealth tax ourselves. We'll collect that revenue ourselves. So when that national wealth tax came into effect, it worked. It brought in considerable revenue. And then Madrid was like, well, if somebody's going to collect that tax, we might as well be the ones to do it. So then it went back to applying its regional wealth tax.
But then Madrid, they were seeing this kind of revenue and were like, hold on, we want that money back. And so what has happened then? Has anyone left Madrid or Spain have billionaires fled Spain? And what's the kind of billionaire numbers like now?
So we've actually seen the number of billionaires in Spain go up from about 26 in 2021 to 34 now. So this has been an effective tax, and we haven't seen, this migration of billionaires that, a scare story would sort of have you believe. The Spanish wealth tax can still be improved, right? And it's still, the upper crust of that wealth, it could still be more effective on that, but it breaks that taboo of applying a wealth tax, which is really important for giving other governments the confidence they need to finally act on wealth tax.
So it's really confusing then, isn't it? Because all the things you've described make this seem like quite an achievable goal, quite an achievable thing for the government to do. So why is it so hard to tax the super rich? What's holding governments back? Can you kind of shed some light on that?
One of the main problems is across the board, we see countries' tax sovereignty is currently really weak. So tax sovereignty is a country's right and its power to decide who to tax, under what terms, and for what purposes.
So it's kind of their ability to collect tax and then use it, essentially.
Yeah. It's the ability not just to set that decision, but to make sure they could follow through on that. So so tax havens undermine that sovereignty by making it possible for folks to get around local tax laws and move their wealth elsewhere. We tend to forget that tax policy is a reflection of democratic will, right? Tax policy and democracy go hand in hand. Modern democracies, as we know them today, started as a fight for tax sovereignty. No taxation without representation. You can have tax sovereignty without democracy. So a dictator can decide what that tax policy is and go about seeing it's implemented. You can't have democracy without tax sovereignty. If your tax decisions do not reflect the will of the people, then those decisions are undemocratic. So what you need is governments to strengthen their tax sovereignty. And there's many ways to do that, but the best shot at that right now is a UN tax convention that countries are negotiating at the UN. So it will completely change how global tax rules are decided. And for the first time in history, these global tax rules will need to be decided publicly in a forum where all voices can be heard, not just giving lobbyists oversized influence.
So you talk about tax sovereignty, and I guess that's a big question, because if you're implementing something like a wealth tax, how do you stop the super rich from just finding new ways to avoid that?
So, one of the hard arguments you hear is if you apply wealth tax, the super rich are going to find ways around it to, underpay tax. So why bother? There's this idea sometimes that is sort of this inevitable natural phenomenon, but it's not. Tax abuse is engineered into our regulations, into our economy. It goes back to this metaphor of codes, of coding the economy. The code is written in such a way that it creates wiggle room to cheat on tax. And in many countries actually rely on the big four accounting firms to write their tax policies, to write their legislation. But then those big four accounting firms then go on to sell to their clients tax abuse schemes to get around the legislations they're drafting, right? So these tax codes, they're written in a way that bakes in the gray space, the wiggle room to cheat on tax. So this is why it's so important to sort of take back control over that code, to sort of make sure the government isn't just listening to lobbyists and the big four accounting firm, but it's listening to the rest of society.
Which comes back to your point about no taxation without representation, right? Where's our representation when we're paying for that opportunity to have our say in that coding process? How hopeful are you, Mark, with Tax Justice Network and even on a personal level, that we're going to see something like this wealth tax introduced in this country or even globally?
I'm very hopeful that we're going to see a wealth tax soon. So governments are discussing moving on this. They're looking into it at national levels, but also at a global level, there's momentum happening on this as well. And a lot of it has to do with how our global tax rules are set. Historically, these have been set behind closed doors, where we know lobbyists for corporations and super rich had oversized influence by a small club of rich countries, a number of which are some of the world's biggest tax havens, right? That way of doing things is now out the door, and countries are now discussing setting up a UN tax convention that replaces that process. And that means for the first time, we can hold governments accountable for the global tax rules they discuss and negotiate and decide on, right? And it also means that our global tax rules have to be in accordance with our human rights laws at the UN. So it's not just about what can we do to maximize profit for shareholders, but also how can tax policy be used to protect people, economies, planet, and so on. So it's all on the table right now like never before. So we are on the cusp of sort of a democratic revolution in tax sovereignty.
I mean, that's really exciting because some of the benefits of introducing a wealth tax, what this could unlock in terms of the potential of it.
Wealth taxes can raise huge sums of money, right? We estimate they could cover most countries' climate finance needs and still leave plenty of money to spend domestically on things like public health and so on. What wealth taxes essentially say is whether you are a wealth collector or a wealth earner, you have an equal responsibility to pitch in your fair share. It ends this two-tier treatment, the special treatment that wealth collectors have gotten over wealth earners for decades now.
If there's one thing you want people to kind of take away from this discussion, kind of keep in their minds around tax and wealth tax in particular, what would it be? What would you want them to take away from this?
If you believe in meritocracy, you should support a wealth tax. It's about choosing how we want our economy to work, what kind of society we want to live in. And what wealth taxes do is they protect that earner way of life we're all relying on.
Thanks so much, Mark. I mean, there's so much to discuss on this, and it's really just a bit of a kind of a introduction to it. And I hope people go away and read lots of, there's so many resources on your website, and we'll include links to that. But it's been fascinating, and I've learned a huge amount. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me. We really appreciate you giving us the time to talk about this important issue.
Thanks, Mark. See you soon.